Saturday qualifying cancelled as torrential rain causes havoc at the Sao Paulo Grand Prix. The result, an early alarm for Sunday morning. Elsewhere, Lando Norris wins the F1 sprint as Max Verstappen receives his latest penalty. From Racing News 365, my name is Nick Golding, and I'm delighted to be joined by lead editor Ian Parks. Ian, what a day. We've only seen an F1 sprint on track because, as I mentioned in my intro, qualifying on Saturday was cancelled due to a torrential shower in Sao Paulo. As a result, for the first time since Japan 2019, qualifying will instead take place very early Sunday morning.
You know what this means, don't you, Nick? Because I've not been in Sao Paulo for this biblical event that took place today, we've missed the sight of Poncho Parks.
Oh, we have? Oh, no!
And for anybody wondering what the hell I'm on about in this conversation with Nick, it's because one of the highlights of the season in recording all these video updates between Nick and I was me wearing one of those see-through ponchos that you're sometimes given out just as a backup, just in case you've forgotten the right clothing to wear. This was me back in Shanghai, Chinese Grand Prix. I think it was the Saturday, or was it? I can't remember, the Friday or the Saturday, Nick.
It was the Friday. It was the Friday.
And it was horrific weather, bucketing it down. And I went and recorded an F1 update outside in the rain wearing one of these see-through ponchos. So if you want to look back, folks, go find that and you'll have a perfect vision of exactly what I was referring to. Sadly, not in Sao Paulo this weekend. Good news is I will be in Las Vegas and Qatar and Abu Dhabi, just to let everybody know. Hurrah. Yes, what a day we have had. Sprint race, and, controversy there with Max's penalty, which I know we're going to get on in a bit of great depth in a few minutes. But then, yes, of course, torrential rain started about half an hour before qualifying was due to start. Never let up pretty much throughout the entirety of the time that followed, when we had these messages coming through from the FIA, delay. Bernd Mailander was yachting around the Interlagos circuit in his Aston Martin safety car, checking the conditions. And of course, the longer that rain stayed, the worse it was getting because of drainage issues, rivers of water running across the track. And finally, we had the call come through that qualifying would be postponed until Sunday morning. And yes, folks, as Nick has mentioned, depending on where you are in the world, of course, it is going to be a much earlier call than as was going to be the case just for the race, as we now have qualifying at 7:30 a.m. local time. That's 10:30 a.m. GMT. 11:30 a.m. in Europe. So perfect times, really, for anybody that's in Europe. And then the race itself will now start 1.5 hours earlier than planned. It was originally due to be at 2 p.m. local time. It's now going to be 12:30 p.m. local time. That's 3:30 p.m. GMT, 4:30 p.m. in Europe. And for our friends in America on the East Coast, that is, I do believe, 10:30 a.m. Correct me if I'm wrong. I do apologize if I have got that one wrong. I didn't look it up before I came on. So, but nevertheless, 3:30, as I say, yes, nice and early for qualifying, nice and earlier race that we have now.
And of course, the big reason for that is we actually correctly predicted. We both got a bold prediction right. We both said on Friday that, beware of the weather on Saturday, because we knew that it looked like the sprint was going to be dry, which was the case. And as you mentioned, it was about half an hour before qualifying where these torrential downpours, thunder and lightning just appeared out of nowhere. Even on the FIA weather radar, there was nothing. All of a sudden, these red cells appeared. The big concern, and perhaps the reason why we've seen qualifying and the race on Sunday taking place earlier than expected, even qualifying on the Sunday is happening earlier than we thought it would be. But the big concern is actually for Sunday, rain is forecast throughout the day, and concerningly, in the afternoon, really from 11 onwards, even heavier than what we've seen today on Saturday. It's, despite the earlier session times for Sunday, there's no guarantee that actually we're going to get a smooth day of uninterrupted action, because it looks worrying.
If that weather forecast is correct, then the way it's looking at this stage is that we should get in qualifying session that early in the morning. Does look like there's still going to be rain in the morning, but nowhere near as heavy as it was on Saturday afternoon into the evening that led to this postponement. However, the major concern is for the race itself, because we look like, as it stands at present, and we're recording this on Saturday night at 9:45 GMT in the UK, the way it's looking for late morning, early afternoon in Sao Paulo is yet more torrential rain. And if there is a repeat of that, as we saw in qualifying, then we very well may not get a race on Sunday. I'm not trying to be a doommonger here in any way, shape or form, folks. I'm just going, again, on the weather forecast from what I can see and from what Nick can see. You've only got to go look at it yourselves. It's not looking great at all. So just be warned that you might be sat in front of your TV screens tomorrow, wherever you might be, waiting for a race to start, and we could get delay after delay again. Fingers crossed we don't. I really hope we do not. Quite obviously, we want to see racing, and we know what the Brazilian Grand Prix is like, Sao Paulo Grand Prix as it is, of course, now known. It's always lent itself to a great race, and it should be the case tomorrow with the wet conditions just playing into that. We could be in for an all-time classic potentially. But we've just got to hope that the rain is not as torrential as is currently forecast and as took place on Saturday afternoon into the evening.
Well, fingers crossed we do get some brilliant action on Sunday, because actually what we saw in the sprint, let's talk about that now, because we have seen some sort of a race, 24 laps of racing we saw earlier on Saturday, and actually it was pretty good action. It was much closer between McLaren, Ferrari and Red Bull than perhaps we were expecting. McLaren didn't escape into the distance as we perhaps feared. Oscar Piastri from pole led the majority of it, but as we suspected, did let Lando Norris pass on lap 22 or 24, but crucially, seconds before a virtual safety car was triggered after Nico Hülkenberg in the second sector ground to a halt with a problem with his Haas. And the big talking point around that VSC is actually at the end of it, because Max Verstappen found himself effectively too close to Oscar Piastri as that period ended. The result, well, Max did provisionally finish third, but received a 5-second time penalty and 1 penalty point, taking him to 7 now, meaning he dropped to 4th. The gap between him and Lando in the championship is now 44 points, so 3 points lower than it was going out of Mexico City. But penalty, no penalty for me, a pretty comfortable 5 seconds in my opinion.
Yeah, this was unfortunate for Max, one of those slam dunk situations. He's had quite a run, hasn't he, Max, when you think about it, and you think of what happened in Singapore with the punishment there for swearing in an official FIA press conference. Then we go on to Austin. Many people believe there he should have had a penalty in tandem with Lando Norris, because obviously Lando got 5 seconds. Many people felt Max should also have received a 5-second penalty for forcing Lando off track in the first place, and him incurring that penalty for overtaking off track. And then, of course, we go into Mexico City, and the 2 10-second penalties that Max incurred there for additional incidents with Lando Norris. Then, of course, we come into this Grand Prix weekend, 5-place grid penalty for Max on Sunday for an additional change of internal combustion engine. And now, as you say, this additional 5-second penalty for the sprint race. This has been quite a turbulent run for Max, and I'm sure he's going to be looking forward to seeing the back of this triple header and getting on to the next one in Vegas, Qatar and Abu Dhabi, because it's not been his time, that's for sure. But he's come through it. He's still got this very healthy 44-point lead. Let's not forget that. This is still a comfortable cushion.
Very healthy.
Very comfortable cushion at the end of the day that he has got. And there's only 112 points left on the table. So it's still going to take one almighty effort or one almighty setback, one almighty effort from McLaren and Lando, and one almighty setback from Red Bull and Max for this gap to be overturned. Nevertheless, today's was, as I say, a slam dunk penalty. Questions raised, of course, as to why it took so long for the VSC to be
Yeah.
implemented. Bearing in mind, we were already running on double wave yellows, I think it was, because Nico Hulkenberg's Haas had pulled off on track, not on a dangerous part of the circuit, certainly not an overtaking place where his car came to rest. And of course, he was stepping out the car at the time. So you've got to bring safety into the consideration. Hence, the VSC came out. However, I know if you're a Max fan or not, you're going to look at that situation, with your own view and say, no, it went against Max. Some people will say it was perfectly correct the way the stewards control implemented the decisions by running for a couple of laps on the double wave yellows before implementing the VSC. But no doubt, regardless of that fact, the situation is Max was a particular delta behind Oscar Piastri when the VSC was called. And at the point when the VSC ended, which was on the last lap going into turn 4, that delta had pretty much disappeared. Max was pretty much alongside Oscar when that VSC ended. It was a 0.63 second gap when the VSC started, and it was pretty much down to 0 when the VSC ended. So under the letter of the law, the letter of the regulations, it was an absolute no-brainer for the stewards in this instance to give Max this 5-second penalty. And as you say, Nick, demoting him from 3rd at the flag to 4th once the classification had been altered, and another point lost to Lando Norris in this F1 drivers' title battle.
And of course, it promoted Charles Leclerc to 3rd as a result. And just to our viewers watching this video, let us know your thoughts and whether you think the VSC was actually the correct decision, and perhaps whether they should have gone to a full safety car, because Ian, as you mentioned, Nico was stepping out of his car prior to the VSC actually being called. So I think an interesting talking point there, and something we may even touch on in the podcast, but I think that all depends on what happens on Sunday, because only knows what's going to happen. Just to quickly go through the results from the sprint earlier on, Lando Norris won from Oscar Piastri, Leclerc in 3rd, Verstappen 4th, Carlos Sainz 5th, George Russell 6th, Pierre Gasly in 7th, Sergio Perez picked up the final points in P8, Lewis Hamilton a disappointing P11. Let's touch on McLaren quickly, because we had the feeling after qualifying, sprint qualifying, that they were the dominant team in the dry, and Oscar Piastri, to his credit, controlled the sprint race beautifully, and of course did then let Lando pass moments prior to the VSC. Very close time by McLaren, I will add. It was a bit touch and go. But going into Sunday, where, okay, we may get a couple of laps of dry running in quali, but in terms of the race itself, regardless of qualifying, the race looks like it is going to be either wet, extremely wet, or not happen altogether. We know that Lando can put a lap together in the wet. We've not, it's a weird one, because is this an advantage for McLaren? Is this a disadvantage? Because actually, for Max Verstappen, we know how good he is in the wet conditions. Does this perhaps play in his hand more and work against McLaren, do you think?
I think Max will have the edge.
Yeah.
We've seen how supreme he is in wet conditions. Again, Lewis Hamilton, we know he's
another driver,
a wet weather king. We know how good he is in the wet. Thing is, when you have conditions like that, as good as you might be, there's always just that moment where you just might get caught out. You've only got to remember to Belgium a couple of years back, and Lando, I think it was, being on an absolute flyer, and he buried his car in the wall at the top of Eau Rouge, if I remember right.
Yeah.
I hope that's right.
Yeah, it was right. Absolutely right.
Yeah, thank you. And, so it just goes to show. And he was having a superb run in the car at the time.
Yeah.
And as I say, one wheel out of place, and it can all very horribly go wrong. And it could be the same for anybody tomorrow. The wet conditions are the greatest of levelers when it comes to Formula One racing, when it comes to any form of motor racing, to be honest. And it's all about who has got the feel and the confidence in those conditions to push their car that little bit further compared to those around them. We know Max can do it. We know Lewis can do it. We know Lando can do it on his day. But as I say, just one moment, just one wheel slightly off, slightly out, and it could change things considerably. So it's going to be whatever transpires on Saturday, in whatever qualifying we might get, in whatever race we might get. it's going to be one hell of a chaotic situation throughout both events looking ahead.
Which could then have a huge say on the both championships, which is, just the excitement we want. I mean, we've already got enough excitement as it is, but there's not too much else for us to talk about, given that we have had no qualifying. So, Ian, I know we did bold predictions for qualifying on Friday, but I think we now need to do fresh bold predictions for qualifying on Sunday. But also on top of that, we've got to do our race predictions, and I'm not sure how we do that, given we haven't seen the grids yet. But you know what? I'm going to give it a go, and I do think we're going to see a completely wet Sunday for the quali and the race, and I can't look past anyone else but Max Verstappen, despite the 5-place grid penalty. No matter where he starts on the grid, I just think him in the wet, he will put in a champion's drive. I can just see it happening. Also keep an eye on the Mercedes, because George Russell is also not too bad when it comes to the wet, thinking back to obviously Belgium 2021 qualifying, if I remember correctly. So I think Mercedes could also be a team to watch on Sunday. What about you? Come on. The boldest of bolds, I think this is going to be today.
I mean, I can't really top that, in fairness, because I would also have gone for Max, regardless of where he's going to be on that grid, unless something catastrophic happens, of course, during qualifying.
Yeah.
Because, as I say, anything can happen. But if you're talking a relatively normal grid slot, and you're looking at, of course, top 3, top 4 for Max, but even then, I would hazard that if it's going to be a wet qualifying, I'm going to put him on the front row.
Yeah.
And if he's on the front row, then you're talking starting 6th, maybe 7th. And even then, I can see him, as you say, coming through, because he will have a fresh engine in that car for a start, fresh internal combustion engine. So that's going to play a little bit in his favour. Another thing that we saw, but less of an impact because it will likely be wet, is the fact that we saw really good race pace in that RB20 in the sprint, which was the positive that both Max and Christian took out of the sprint event, not least as well because they saw Checo rise from 13th on the grid to finish in the points, as you mentioned earlier, in eighth position. Yeah. He had a decent drive. That was probably one of his best performances for quite some time. All of a sudden, there's a bit of race pace in that RB20. But, of course, when it comes to a wet race, that really doesn't matter too much. So, but everything combined, fresh engine, good race pace, and Max being good in the wet, then yes, I can see him taking the Grand Prix victory on Sunday.
Just finally, something I did actually think about we've not touched on is, given that Sunday is looking to be pretty wet, both in qualifying and the race. Obviously, Liam Lawson last year got a bit of experience in the wet in Zandvoort. In the first race, he replaced Daniel Ricciardo. He got one hell of a way to make your F1 debut. But obviously, for Ollie Behrman and Franco Colapinto, looking ahead to Sunday, this is going to be some massive pressure for them because, I mean, it's not going to be fun, you'd imagine, especially their first laps in the wet.
Well, Liam Lawson, as you said, Dutch Grand Prix.
Lots of him.
Had a terrific weekend in the Dutch Grand Prix. That was the weekend that he was thrown in at the deep end because Daniel Ricciardo had that crash in practice. And he performed superbly. Brought the car home, which was, and in a reasonable position as well, which was all that could possibly be expected of him across that weekend. So at least he's got the benefit of that experience to fall back on. Franco Colapinto, however, this is going to be completely new territory for him. He has not run in the wet in an F1 car, nor had any practice in the wet in an F1 car. So it's a baptism of fire for Franco in many respects. He was not happy with his performance. He's not been happy with his performance across this weekend in sprint qualifying and the sprint. Felt he could have got more out of himself and the car. So now this is going to be a real acid test for him as to his credentials going forward, because we know he's been exalted so far by many people up and down the paddock, and he's been suggested as a possibility for the spare stake seat going into next year. He's also been rumoured as potentially being in an RB next season should Liam Lawson get promoted in favour of Checo Perez for 2025. So there's going to be a lot of eyes on Franco Colapinto, not just up and down the pit lane, but the eyes of South America are also upon him because he has had such huge support across this Brazilian Grand Prix weekend so far. Apparently all flights out of Buenos Aires have been fully booked for quite some time since it was announced that Franco was going to be in that car for Williams for the final 9 Grand Prix of this season. So he's got a lot of support and a lot of backing behind him, and they're going to be willing him to do well. So, yes, as I say, a lot of eyes on Franco. Less so Liam, but even so, as someone that's pushing for that Red Bull seat for next year, or just the RB seat, he's going to have to produce the goods in the ultimate of conditions, that's for sure.
Well, I think it's a huge well done to all the fans who stuck it out in the horrible conditions. Hopefully they're rewarded with some incredible action on Sunday. And that's the big message, I think, to all the people watching this video. If there is running on Sunday, do not miss it, because I get the feeling it's going to be pretty special. This has been the postponed qualifying F1 update with myself, Nick Golding, and Ian Parks. Be sure to join us on Sunday, hopefully after the race. See you later.
Take care, folks. Stay dry.